The wind came down from the mountains like a blade. Eli Thorn felt it cut through the thin fabric of his coat as he guided his horse along the narrow trail that descended into Red Hollow. Below, the mining outpost sprawled across the valley floor like a wound in the earth, raw, bleeding, and alive with desperate men chasing fortunes they'd never find. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys. The sound of hammers on rock echoed against the canyon walls, a relentless percussion that never stopped, day or night. January 1872. The Montana Territory was a land of extremes, and Red Hollow represented the worst of them. Eli pulled his hat lower, shielding his face from the wind and from the eyes that would soon be watching. At 23, he'd learned that survival meant becoming invisible, a lesson carved into him through years of running, hiding, and reinventing himself in places where questions could get you killed. His face was lean and weathered beyond his years, his hands calloused from work he'd done in half a dozen territories under half a dozen names. But here, in this brutal settlement where the strong devoured the weak, he would be Eli Thorn. Nothing more. Nothing less. The horse picked its way down the rocky slope, its breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. Eli kept his eyes on the town, reading it the way a gambler reads cards. The main street was a river of mud churned by wagon wheels and boots. Buildings leaned against each other like drunks, saloons, supply stores, a blacksmith shop belching black smoke, boarding houses with windows dark as empty eye sockets. Men moved through the street with the hunched, predatory posture of wolves. This was a place where law existed only in the barrels of guns and the fists of those strong enough to enforce their will. Perfect. In a town this harsh, a stranger who kept his mouth shut and his head down could disappear. And disappearing was exactly what Eli needed. "You lost, boy?" The voice came from behind a stack of lumber near the trail's end. Eli's hand drifted toward the knife at his belt, but he forced himself to relax, to show nothing. A man stepped out, big, barrel-chested, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that measured Eli with casual contempt. "No, sir," Eli said, his voice flat and neutral. "Looking for work." The man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Work." He laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Everyone's looking for work, boy, or looking to steal from those who got it. Which are you?" "The first." "You got a trade?" "I can do anything that needs doing." The man's eyes traveled over Eli, the worn clothes, the lean frame, the careful way he held himself. "Anything, huh? You look like a strong wind would snap you in half. You ever worked a mine?" "I've worked harder things than mines." Something flickered in the man's expression. Not respect, but a grudging acknowledgement that Eli hadn't flinched. "Name's Dutch Keller. I run the supply depot and half the work crews in this cesspit. You want work? You work for me. $1 a day, 6 days a week. Sundays you're on your own, but I dock you if you're too hungover to show Monday morning." "I don't drink," Keller snorted. "You will. This place'll drive you to it or drive you out. Most don't last a month." He jerked his thumb toward the town. "Boarding house is third building on the left. Tell Maggie I sent you. She'll give you a bunk, 10 cents a night, extra if you want meals. Be at the depot at dawn tomorrow. You're late? You're fired." Eli nodded and guided his horse past Keller without another word. Behind him, he heard the big man mutter something to another worker, followed by rough laughter. It didn't matter. Laughter he could handle. Curiosity was the danger. The boarding house was exactly what he expected. A sagging two-story structure that smelled of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and boiled cabbage. A woman who might have been 40 or 60 stood behind a makeshift counter, her face as hard and unforgiving as the mountains that surrounded them. "Maggie?" Eli asked. "Who's asking?" "Eli Thorn. Dutch Keller sent me." She looked him over with the same dismissive calculation every person in this town seemed to possess. 10 cents a night. 15 if you want breakfast and supper. You pay a week in advance or you sleep in the street. Eli counted out coins from his dwindling supply and placed them on the counter. Maggie swept them into her apron without counting, then pulled a key from a hook on the wall. "Third floor, end of the hall. Don't cause trouble. Don't bring women. Don't steal. Break any of those rules and I'll have the boys throw you into the creek, and I don't care how cold it is." "Understood." She handed him the key. You running from something? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. Eli met her eyes without blinking. Everyone here is running from something. Maggie's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Smart answer. Maybe you'll last longer than most. She paused. Word of advice. Keep to yourself. This town eats the weak and spits out the nosy. Eli took the key and climbed the narrow stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The hallway was dark and smelled of mildew. His room was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a chair, and a washstand with a cracked basin. A single window looked out over the alley behind the building, where garbage rotted in piles and rats moved in the shadows. He sat on the bed and allowed himself one long breath, the first moment of stillness since he'd ridden into the valley. Through the thin walls, he could hear the sounds of Red Hollow settling into its evening rhythm. Shouting from the saloons, a woman's laughter cut short, the crack of something breaking, men arguing about cards or claims or women. Violence simmered just beneath the surface of every sound. This was his life now. A room barely fit for an animal, a job that would break most men, and a town full of people who'd kill for the change in his pocket. But it was also anonymity, safety, a place where his past couldn't follow because everyone was too busy surviving their own present. Eli pulled off his boots and lay back on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, feeling the tight binding beneath his shirt, the secret he carried every moment of every day, the truth that would get him killed faster than any crime or debt. In the world Eli came from, certain truths were unforgivable. You could be a thief, a drunk, a killer. Those sins could be understood, even accepted. But to be born female and live as a man? That was an abomination. A deception that would earn you a noose or worse, mockery, violence, the kind of attention that stripped away every shred of dignity before it took your life. So Eli Thorn was careful, obsessively careful. He changed clothes in private, bathed in darkness, never let his guard down for a second. He'd learned to walk like men walked, to take up space the way men did, to lower his voice and speak with the casual authority that came so naturally to those born into it. He'd learned to survive in a body that felt like both armor and prison. And he'd learned that the only way to truly be safe was to become invisible, just another drifter, another nobody trying to scratch out a living in the territories. Morning came hard and cold. Eli woke before dawn, dressed in the darkness, and made his way through the frozen streets to the supply depot. Other men were already gathering, rough, hard-faced laborers who looked at him with the same measuring contempt Keller had shown. Nobody spoke. They just waited, shoulders hunched against the cold, until Keller emerged from the depot office. "Listen up," Keller's voice cut through the morning air. "We got 3 wagons heading up to the northern claims. Need men to haul equipment, set up sluice lines, and clear debris. It's rock work, hard, mean, and cold. You work till I say stop. Anyone slacks off gets docked. Anyone quits gets blacklisted. Questions?" Silence. "Good. Load up." The work was exactly as brutal as promised. Eli threw himself into it with single-minded focus, hefting crates that made other men grunt, hauling stones until his muscles screamed, working through the pain because stopping meant standing out, and standing out meant questions. By midday, his hands were bleeding through his gloves. By afternoon, his back felt like it had been beaten with hammers. But he didn't slow down. The other workers noticed. "Hey, kid." One of them, a scarred man with missing teeth, jerked his chin at Eli during a water break. "You trying to make the rest of us look bad?" Eli drank from his canteen without responding. "I'm talking to you." "I'm just working. Working like a man possessed. You think Keller's going to pay you extra for being an ass kisser?" Eli met his eyes calmly. "I think I'm here to work. Same as you." The scarred man stepped closer, looking for a fight. But another worker, older, with iron-gray hair and steady hands, put a hand on his shoulder. "Leave it, Tommy. Kid's got the right idea. Work hard, keep your head down, collect your pay. That's all any of us are here for." Tommy shook off the hand but backed away, muttering curses. The older man gave Eli a brief nod before returning to his own work. Eli filed the interaction away. Potential ally, potential threat. Impossible to know yet. In places like Red Hollow, allegiances shifted like sand. The days blurred into a rhythm of pain and exhaustion. Eli worked, ate, slept, and worked again. He spoke only when spoken to. He never went to the saloons, never gambled, never got involved in the fights that erupted nightly in the streets. He was a ghost, present but unseen, working but unremarkable. And slowly, grudgingly, Red Hollow began to accept him. Keller started giving him harder jobs, the ones that required endurance and discipline rather than brute strength. Eli hauled supplies through mountain passes that other men refused to attempt. He worked through blizzards that sent experienced laborers running for shelter. He never complained, never asked for special treatment, never showed weakness. "You're either stupid or stubborn," Keller told him one evening after Eli had completed a particularly grueling delivery. "Haven't figured out which yet." "Does it matter?" Eli asked. Keller laughed, a genuine sound this time. "No, I suppose it doesn't. Long as you keep showing up, you'll have work." Weeks turned into months. Winter tightened its grip on the valley, transforming Red Hollow into a frozen hellscape where the temperature rarely rose above freezing and the wind howled through the streets like a living thing. Men died, from cave-ins, from fights, from simple exhaustion and cold. The cemetery on the hill grew faster than the town below, but Eli survived. He survived, and in surviving he earned something more valuable than gold: respect. Not friendship. Red Hollow wasn't a place for friends, but the acknowledgement that he was strong enough, tough enough, and silent enough to be left alone. That was all he needed. Then came the morning that changed everything. Eli was hauling water from the creek when he saw the old Chinese man being dragged from one of the bunkhouses. 3 miners had him by the arms, shouting accusations in broken English mixed with vicious slurs. A crowd was gathering, drawn by the scent of violence the way wolves were drawn to blood. "Thief! Caught him stealing from the company store." The old man was small, frail, his face bruised and bloodied. He was saying something in Cantonese, his voice thin and desperate, but nobody was listening. They never listened. In Red Hollow, Chinese laborers were less than human. Tools to be used and discarded, scapegoats for every missing item and every failure in the mines. Eli should have walked away, should have kept his head down and pretended not to see. Getting involved in someone else's trouble was the fastest way to invite your own. But something in the old man's face stopped him, the resignation, the acceptance of his own death. Eli had seen that look before, in a mirror, in the moments when hiding became too exhausting and the thought of simply giving up seemed like mercy. "Wait." The word came out before Eli could stop it. The crowd turned, 50 pairs of hostile eyes fixing on him. "What'd you say, kid?" One of the miners, a massive brute named Garrett, still had the old man by the collar. Eli's heart hammered in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I said wait. What did he steal?" "That ain't your concern. If you're going to hang a man, seems like people should know what for." Garrett's face darkened. "You defending this yellow thief?" "I'm asking what he stole. Simple question." "Tools. A hammer and some nails. Caught him red-handed." Eli looked at the old man who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. Then he looked back at Garrett. "Where are they?" "The tools he stole?" "We ain't found them yet, but we will." "So you didn't catch him red-handed. You just decided he was guilty." The crowd murmured. Garrett's hand moved toward the gun at his hip. "You calling me a liar, boy?" This was the moment. Eli could back down, apologize, walk away. It would be smart. It would be safe. But safety had never been the same as living. "I'm saying if you're going to accuse a man of stealing, you should have proof. Otherwise, you're just a bully looking for an excuse to hurt someone weaker." Silence fell like a hammer. Garrett released the old man and took a step toward Eli, his massive hands curling into fists. "You got a death wish, kid." "No, but I don't think he's a thief, and I don't think you care either way." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Keller's voice cut through the tension. "Garrett, stand down." Garrett spun. "This little shit just—" "I heard what he said." Keller pushed through the crowd, his expression unreadable. He looked at the old man, then at Eli, then back at Garrett. "You got proof?" "He's Chinese. That's all the proof I need." "That ain't proof. That's prejudice." Keller turned to the crowd. Anyone actually see him take anything? Silence. Then this is done. Let him go. Like hell. I said let him go, Garrett. You got a problem with that. You can take it up with me. Garrett's face was purple with rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to challenge Keller directly. He shoved the old man to the ground and stalked off, the crowd dispersing with disappointed mutters. Show's over. Nothing to see. Eli helped the old man to his feet. Up close, he could see the man was ancient, 70 at least, his face a map of wrinkles and scars, but his eyes were clear, intelligent, and deeply grateful. Thank you, he said in careful, accented English. You did not have to do that. Neither did you have to steal. If you did. A small smile crossed the old man's face. I did not. But in this place, truth does not matter much. No, I suppose it doesn't. I am Tao Lin. He bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that seemed alien in this brutal place. Eli Thorn. You are new here, Eli Thorn, new enough to still have mercy. Be careful. Red Hollow kills that quality quickly. Before Eli could respond, Tao Lin turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the maze of shacks and tents on the outskirts of town, where the Chinese laborers lived in squalid isolation. Keller appeared at Eli's shoulder. That was stupid. Probably. Garrett's going to remember that. He's the type who holds grudges. I'll deal with it if it comes. Keller studied him for a long moment. You got more spine than sense, kid. I can't decide if that's going to get you killed or make you a fortune. He paused. You ever think about leaving town? Going up into the high country? Why would I do that? Because I got a contract for a winter herding job. 3 months alone in the mountains, keeping livestock alive through the worst weather this territory's got to offer. Pays triple what you're making now, but it's brutal work. Most men can't handle the isolation. They come back broken, if they come back at all. Eli's pulse quickened. Isolation. 3 months where nobody would watch him, question him, or demand answers. 3 months to let his guard down, to breathe without fear. I'll take it, he said. Keller raised an eyebrow. Just like that? You don't even know where it is. Doesn't matter. I'll take it. You're either the bravest fool I've ever met or the most desperate. Either way, it's your funeral. Keller pulled a folded map from his pocket and handed it over. Supply cabin's marked. You leave in 3 days. Provisions are already there. Sheep are in the high meadow. Keep them alive. Keep yourself alive. Come back in the spring. That's the job. Eli took the map, his hands steady despite the hammering of his heart. Understood. That night, lying in his narrow bed, Eli allowed himself a rare moment of something close to hope. 3 months alone. 3 months without the constant vigilance, the endless performance, the exhausting act of being someone he wasn't born to be. 3 months to simply exist. He didn't let himself think about what would happen after, about whether he could come back to Red Hollow and resume the mask, or whether the taste of freedom would make the cage unbearable. Those were questions for the future. For now, he had 3 days to prepare. The morning of his departure, Eli loaded his horse with supplies, enough food to supplement what was at the cabin, extra ammunition, warm clothes, and the few personal items he owned. The town was just waking up, smoke rising from chimneys, men stumbling out of saloons to face another day of brutal labor. He was almost at the edge of town when a figure stepped out from behind a building. Tao Lin. The old man held out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. For your journey. Eli hesitated, then took it. Inside was dried meat, rice cakes, and something that smelled like herbs. Thank you, but you shouldn't waste your food on me. It is not waste. You stood for me when no one else would. That deserves acknowledgement. Tao Lin's eyes were sharp, knowing. You go to be alone, yes? To the winter mountains? How did you... I listen. I watch. It is how I survive. He smiled, a gentle expression that transformed his worn face. Solitude is a gift, Eli Thorn. Use it well. And when you return, if you return, perhaps we will speak again. There was something in the way he said it, a recognition, an understanding that went beyond words. Eli felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Perhaps, he said quietly. Tao Lin bowed again and walked away, disappearing into the waking town like smoke. Eli turned his horse toward the mountains and rode without looking back. The journey took 2 days of hard climbing through snow and ice. The trail grew narrower, more treacherous, until it was barely visible, just a thread of cleared ground winding between towering pines and sheer rock faces. The temperature dropped with each mile, the wind growing teeth that bit through every layer of clothing. But Eli felt something unexpected rising in his chest. Excitement. With each step away from Red Hollow, the weight on his shoulders grew lighter. There was no one to perform for out here, no one to lie to, no one to fear, just the mountains, the sky, and the brutal honesty of nature. The cabin appeared on the afternoon of the second day, nestled in a small valley protected by steep ridges on 3 sides. It was rough, but solid. Log walls chinked against the wind, a stone chimney, shuttered windows, and a lean-to for the horse. Nearby, a stream cut through the snow, still running despite the cold. Eli dismounted and stood in the silence, listening. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant cry of a hawk. No voices, no machinery, no human presence for miles in any direction. For the first time in years, Eli Thorn smiled. The cabin was stocked as promised: flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, and basic tools. A rifle hung over the fireplace, ammunition stored in a metal box. The furniture was simple: a bed, a table, 2 chairs, shelves for supplies, a wood stove for heat and cooking. Everything a person needed to survive, nothing more. Eli spent the rest of the day settling in, unpacking supplies, checking the roof for leaks, gathering firewood from the surrounding forest. As twilight fell, he lit the stove and made coffee, then sat at the table watching darkness claim the valley. The sheep were where Keller said they'd be, huddled in the high meadow, about a mile from the cabin. 50 head of hardy mountain breed, bred for this kind of brutal environment. Eli's job was to keep them alive through the winter, to protect them from predators, move them to sheltered grazing when storms came, and ensure they didn't wander off cliffs or freeze in the brutal cold. It was work that required constant vigilance and daily presence, but it was also work that could be done alone. Completely alone. That night, for the first time since leaving home years ago, Eli Thorn allowed the performance to slip. He unwound the binding that compressed his chest, feeling the relief as his ribs expanded fully, as his body relaxed into its natural shape. He stood in front of the cracked mirror that hung on the cabin wall and looked at himself, really looked, without the careful construction of masculine presentation. The person in the mirror was thin, angular, with short cropped dark hair and a face that could pass for either gender if you didn't look too closely. Years of binding and hard labor had flattened his chest, given him the lean, ropey muscle of someone who survived through strength and endurance. But the eyes were the same, sharp, guarded, carrying secrets that could never be spoken. Eliana, he whispered to his reflection. The name felt strange on his tongue, a ghost from a life he barely remembered. His mother had called him that, before everything fell apart. Before his father's death, before his mother's descent into madness and drink, before the desperate flight into the territories and the decision to become someone, anyone, other than who he'd been born to be. Eli had survived. Eliana would have died a dozen times over, so Eli was who he remained. But here, in this cabin with no witnesses, he could let both versions exist, could acknowledge the complexity of living in a body that didn't match the world's expectations, of building an identity from necessity and survival rather than choice. He rewound the binding, habit, and protection, but allowed himself to sleep without the full armor of masculine performance. Just this once. Just for tonight. The winter came down like a hammer. Storms rolled through the valley with relentless fury, burying the world in white. Temperatures dropped until Eli's breath froze in the air, and the creek turned to solid ice. The sheep huddled together for warmth, and Eli spent his days breaking paths through the snow so they could reach what little grazing remained, bringing them hay from the storage shed, checking for injuries and illness. The work was endless and exhausting, but it was also strangely peaceful. Weeks passed, then months. Eli fell into a rhythm that had nothing to do with Red Hollow or the performance of being someone else. He woke with the sun, tended the sheep, hunted when food ran low, repaired equipment, and spent the evenings reading by lamplight or simply sitting in silence, watching the fire burn. The solitude that Keller said would break most men became Eli's sanctuary. He learned the language of the mountains, how to read the weather and the color of the sky, how to track animals by the subtle signs they left in the snow, how to find shelter before storms hit, and food when supplies ran low. He learned the names of the sheep, their individual personalities, the ones who were leaders and the ones who would wander if not watched. And he learned things about himself. That he was stronger than he'd believed. That silence wasn't loneliness. That the constant fear he'd lived with for years, the terror of discovery, of exposure, of violent rejection, could ease when there was no one around to fear. That perhaps, in some deep way, this was who he was meant to be, not man or woman in the way the world defined those terms, but something else entirely. Someone who existed outside those narrow boxes, who'd carved out a life through sheer determination and refused to be contained by others' expectations. Up here, in the brutal honesty of winter, Eli Thorn was simply himself, and that was enough. But peace never lasted forever. It was late February when he saw the smoke. Eli was checking the northern fence line when he spotted it, a thin column rising from the valley below, near where he knew a hunting camp sometimes operated. That alone wouldn't have worried him, but this smoke was wrong, too much of it, too dark, the color of structures burning rather than controlled fires. He stood watching for a long moment, instinct warning him to stay away, to mind his own business. But something about the smoke nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. The next morning, he rode down to investigate. The hunting camp was destroyed. 3 cabins reduced to blackened timber and ash, bodies in the snow, 4 men killed by gunshots and left to freeze. Eli moved through the scene with careful steps, reading the story written in blood and tracks. An attack. Professional, coordinated. The attackers had come in the night, killed everyone, and burned the buildings to destroy evidence. But they'd missed something, a trail of footprints leading away from the camp, smaller than the others, heading toward the deeper wilderness. Someone had escaped. Eli should have ridden away, should have returned to his cabin and forgotten what he'd seen. This wasn't his fight, wasn't his problem. But he thought about Tao Lin, about standing up when no one else would, about the cost of looking away when you could act. He followed the tracks. It took 3 hours of careful tracking through dense forest before he found him. A young Chinese man, barely 20, half frozen and delirious with cold and terror. He'd been shot in the shoulder, the wound crudely bandaged with strips of his own shirt. When he saw Eli, he tried to run but collapsed in the snow. Eli dismounted and approached slowly, hands visible. "Easy, I'm not going to hurt you." The young man said something in rapid Cantonese, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't understand," Eli said quietly. "But you're hurt, and you'll die out here if you don't get help. Will you let me help you?" For a long moment they stared at each other, 2 strangers in a frozen wilderness, both carrying wounds the world couldn't see. Then, slowly, the young man nodded. Eli got him onto the horse and began the long ride back to the cabin, wondering what the hell he'd just gotten himself into, and knowing, with absolute certainty, that everything had just changed. The young man's name was Wei. Eli learned this on the 2nd day after the fever broke and Wei could finally speak without delirium clouding his words. He lay on Eli's bed, wrapped in every blanket the cabin possessed, his shoulder bandaged with clean cloth and treated with the limited medical supplies Eli had on hand. The bullet had passed through, a mercy that probably saved his life. But infection was still a threat, and Wei's body had been pushed to its absolute limits by cold and trauma. "Wei," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Wei." Eli nodded from where he sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. "I'm Eli. You're safe here." Wei's eyes moved around the cabin, taking in the rough walls, the burning stove, the supplies stacked neatly on shelves. "The others?" "Dead. I'm sorry." Wei closed his eyes, and for a moment Eli thought he might cry, but when he opened them again, there was only a terrible, empty acceptance. "They were my friends. We worked together in the mines, saved money together, dreamed together, and now, what happened?" Wei was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, drained of emotion. "Men came in the night, white men with guns and torches. They said we were trespassing on land they'd bought, that we had to leave. But we had papers, legitimate papers from the land office. My friend Chen showed them. They shot him in the face. Eli's hand stilled on the rifle. They killed everyone. Shot them, burned everything. I was in the outhouse when it started. I heard the screaming, saw the fire. I should have helped, should have fought. But I ran. Wei's voice cracked. I am a coward. You're alive. That's not cowardice. That's survival. Survival for what? To live knowing I abandoned them? Eli set down the rifle and moved to the bedside. Listen to me. I've lived enough years to know the difference between cowardice and wisdom. Running. When you can't win isn't weakness. It's the only smart choice. Your friends are dead. Nothing you could have done would have changed that. But you're alive, and that means their deaths weren't completely meaningless. You can remember them. Tell their story. That matters. Wei stared at him, searching his face. You speak like someone who understands running. Because I do. They held each other's gaze for a moment, two people carrying secrets they couldn't speak aloud, bound by the unspoken recognition that survival sometimes meant becoming someone other than who you'd been. Over the following weeks, Wei slowly recovered. The wound healed cleaner than Eli had dared hope, and Wei's natural resilience, forged by years of brutal labor in the mines, pulled him back from the edge of death. As his strength returned, he began helping around the cabin, insisting despite Eli's protests that he needed to earn his place. You saved my life, Wei said one morning as they prepared to check on the sheep. In my culture, that creates a debt that cannot be easily repaid. There's no debt. You needed help. I gave it. Nevertheless, I will help you. It is the right thing to do. Eli had spent months alone, and part of him resented the intrusion into his carefully constructed solitude. But another part, a part he'd almost forgotten existed, found unexpected comfort in Wei's presence. They worked in companionable silence, two people who understood that words weren't always necessary, that sometimes simply being present was enough. Wei proved himself invaluable. He knew how to repair things Eli would have discarded, how to stretch supplies further than seemed possible, how to read animal behavior in ways Eli hadn't learned. He taught Eli phrases in Cantonese, and Eli taught him the more subtle complexities of English. They shared meals, shared work, and slowly, carefully, began to share pieces of their stories. I came from Guangdong province, Wei said one evening as they sat by the fire. My family were farmers, but the land couldn't support us all. When I was 16, I signed a contract to work in America. 3 years of labor to pay for passage, then I would be free. That was 8 years ago. You're still not free? Wei laughed bitterly. The debt never ends. They add charges for food, for shelter, for tools. You work, and the amount you owe only grows. When I tried to leave, they threatened to have me arrested for breach of contract. So I ran, found Chen and the others, men who'd escaped the same trap. We pooled our money, bought that land legally, thought we could build something real. He stared into the fire. We were fools. You weren't fools for wanting freedom. The system is what's wrong, not you. And you? Wei asked quietly. What are you running from? Eli felt his chest tighten, the old fear rising automatically. But something about Wei's presence, about the isolation of the cabin and the months of solitude that had worn down his defenses, made him want to speak. Not the full truth, that was still too dangerous, but something close to it. I'm running from being someone I never wanted to be, Eli said slowly. From a life that was chosen for me instead of by me. From people who would destroy me if they knew who I really was. Wei nodded, asking nothing more. And in that moment, Eli felt a surge of gratitude for this young man who understood the power of silence, who knew that some truths were best left unspoken, but acknowledged nonetheless. The winter began its slow retreat. Days grew fractionally longer, the brutal cold easing into merely freezing temperatures. The sheep survived, all 50 head accounted for, and in relatively good health, a minor miracle given the harshness of the season. Eli and Wei worked together to prepare for the spring thaw, reinforcing fences, stockpiling firewood, checking equipment. But the peace couldn't last. It was early March when Tao Lin appeared. Eli was outside splitting wood when he saw the figure trudging up the valley, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone conserving energy on a long journey. For a moment he didn't recognize the old man. Tao Lin was bundled in layers of ragged clothing, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But then he looked up and Eli saw those sharp, knowing eyes. "Tao Lin?" Eli set down the axe. "What are you doing here?" The old man reached the cabin and leaned heavily against the wall, breathing hard. "I came to warn you." Wei appeared in the doorway and his eyes widened. "Uncle Tao!" "Wei!" Tao Lin's face transformed with shock and relief. "You are alive. We heard about the attack, found the bodies, but you were not among them. I thought perhaps, but I did not dare hope." Wei crossed the space in 3 strides and embraced the old man, speaking rapidly in Cantonese. Tao Lin responded in kind, his voice thick with emotion. Eli watched them, feeling like an intruder on a private moment, until Tao Lin pulled back and switched to English. "I'm glad you found safety here, but we do not have much time. That is why I came." "Time for what?" Eli asked. Tao Lin's expression grew grave. "The men who killed Wei's friends. They were not random killers. They work for a man named Silas Crane. He is buying up land throughout this territory, using whatever means necessary. Violence, fraud, intimidation. Those who resist disappear or die in convenient accidents." "Why are you telling us this?" "Because Crane's men have been asking questions in Red Hollow. About you, Eli Thorn. About the winter herding contract. About this cabin. About who owns the land you're on." Eli felt ice form in his stomach. "This is Keller's land. The contract was legitimate when it was signed, but Crane has purchased Keller's debts, purchased the land rights, purchased everything. He now owns most of Red Hollow, and he wants everyone off land he considers his, including you." "Then I'll leave. I'll finish the contract and go." "It is not that simple." Tao Lin pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and handed it to Eli. "This is a notice that was posted in town 3 days ago. Read it." Eli unfolded the paper. The print was crude but clear. Notice of claim. All lands within the Red Hollow mining district, including associated grazing territories and water rights, are hereby claimed under legitimate purchase by the Crane Land Development Company. Any persons occupying said lands without written authorization from Silas Crane or his designated representatives are considered trespassers and will be removed by legal force. All structures, livestock, and improvements on disputed land become property of the Crane Company. Resistance will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of territorial law. Eli read it twice, his mind racing. "This can't be legal." "Legal doesn't matter when you have enough money and guns," Wei said quietly. "I have seen this before. They use law as a weapon, twist it until it means whatever serves them." Keller never said anything about selling. Tao Lin's voice was gentle but firm. Keller had no choice. He owed money to the wrong people, and they sold his debts to Crane. Now Crane owns everything Keller owned, including the contract that brought you here. And Crane does not honor contracts that don't benefit him. Eli looked down at the notice, feeling the familiar urge to run rising in his chest. It would be easy. Pack his things, abandon the sheep, disappear into the territories the way he'd done a dozen times before. Start over somewhere new with a new name and new lies. But something had changed during the winter. Something about the months of solitude and hard-won peace, about Wei's presence and the small community they'd built in this isolated valley, had planted roots deeper than Eli realized. For the first time in years, he didn't want to run. "When are they coming?" Eli asked. "Soon, perhaps days, perhaps weeks. But they will come." Wei stepped forward. "Then we should leave together, all 3 of us. We can go north to Canada. Start over where Crane's reach doesn't extend." "No." The word came out harder than Eli intended. He softened his tone. "I'm tired of running. This land, it's not much, but I've worked it. I've survived here. I've earned the right to stay." "Earned right means nothing to men like Crane," Tao Lin said. "Maybe. But I'm done letting men like him decide where I can exist." Wei and Tao Lin exchanged a look. Then Wei said, "If you stay, we stay. You don't have to." "We know. But you stood for me when you could have walked away. You gave me shelter when I would have died. And you, Uncle Tao, you came all this way to warn us. We are bound together now, whether we chose it or not. So if Eli stays, we stay. Tao Lin nodded slowly. Then we must prepare. If Crane's men come, they will come with violence. We need to be ready. The next 2 weeks transformed the cabin from a shelter into a fortress. They reinforced the walls with additional logs, covered the windows with shutters that could be barred from inside, stockpiled ammunition and supplies. Eli taught Wei to shoot and was surprised to discover the young man was a natural marksman. Tao Lin, despite his age, proved invaluable. He knew how to set traps, how to create defensive positions, how to turn everyday items into weapons. I was a soldier once, he explained when Eli questioned his knowledge. Before I came to this country, before I became just another coolie to be exploited and dismissed. They worked dawn to dusk, driven by the knowledge that every day could be their last peaceful one. The sheep were moved to a more defensible location, closer to the cabin where they could be watched. Supplies were cached in multiple locations in case they needed to flee. Escape routes were planned and rehearsed. But even as they prepared for violence, something else grew between them. A sense of family that none of them had experienced in years. They shared meals, stories, laughter. Wei taught them songs from his homeland. Tao Lin shared ancient proverbs and philosophy. Eli found himself opening up in ways he never had before, speaking about his childhood, about the father he'd lost and the life he'd fled, carefully skirting the most dangerous truths but sharing enough that both men understood his pain. One night, as they sat around the fire after a particularly long day of work, Wei asked, "What will you do if we survive this? If Crane's men come and we drive them away?" Eli considered the question. "I don't know. I've spent so long focused on surviving the next day that I've never thought much about the future." "Perhaps that is something worth changing," Tao Lin said quietly. "A life lived only in fear of tomorrow is not truly living." Easy to say, harder to do. All worthwhile things are hard. That does not make them less worthwhile. Wei leaned forward. "I think if we survive, we should stay. Build something real here. Not just a cabin, but a life. A place where people who don't fit anywhere else can find refuge." "A beautiful dream," Eli said. "But dreams don't stop bullets." "No, but they give us a reason to face the bullets rather than run from them." Eli looked at these two men, one young and idealistic, one old and wise, both outcasts in a world that had no place for them, and felt something shift in his chest. Maybe Wei was right. Maybe it was time to stop running, to plant roots and defend them, to build something worth protecting. "All right," Eli said. "If we survive this, we stay. We build. We make this place into something that matters." They shook hands on it, sealing the promise with the simple gravity of people who understood that promises meant something only when they cost you something to keep. The attack came on a gray morning in late March. Eli was the first to see them. 6 riders approaching from the south, moving with the casual confidence of men who expected no resistance. He rang the bell they'd installed as a warning system, and Wei and Tao Lin immediately moved to their positions. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. Their leader was a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes, the kind of man who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, "You in the cabin! This is private property! You're trespassing!" Eli stepped out onto the porch, rifle held loosely in his hands but ready to raise and fire in an instant. "I have a contract with Dutch Keller for this land through spring. I'm not trespassing." "Keller doesn't own this land anymore. Silas Crane does, and Mr. Crane wants you gone." "Then Mr. Crane can come tell me himself." The scarred man's expression hardened. "You think this is a negotiation? You got 10 minutes to pack your things and clear out. Anything you leave behind becomes company property. That includes the sheep. And if I refuse? Then we remove you by force, and you don't want that, boy. Trust me." Eli felt his heart hammering but kept his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." "Your funeral?" The scarred man turned to his companions. "Boys, show this fool what happens to people who don't cooperate." 3 of the riders dismounted and pulled torches from their saddlebags. They lit them with practiced ease, clearly not the first time they'd burned someone out. But as they started forward, Eli raised his rifle and fired a shot into the ground directly in front of the lead man. The riders stopped. Next one goes through flesh instead of dirt, Eli said. I suggest you rethink your approach. The scarred man's hand dropped to his pistol. You just made a very stupid mistake. Maybe, but I'm done being pushed around by men who think might makes right. For a long moment, tension hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Then a window shutter cracked open and Wei's rifle barrel emerged, and another shutter opened to reveal Tao Lin's weathered face behind a shotgun. The riders saw it, saw they were outnumbered and outpositioned. The scarred man's jaw tightened. This ain't over. Mr. Crane doesn't like being told no. Then Mr. Crane is going to have a problem because I'm not moving. The riders remounted and turned their horses, but the scarred man looked back one last time. You're a dead man, boy. You just don't know it yet. They rode away, and Eli lowered his rifle with shaking hands. He'd expected to feel triumph or relief or even fear. Instead, he felt only a strange, hollow certainty that the real fight hadn't even begun. Wei emerged from the cabin. That was incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. Probably both. Tao Lin joined them on the porch, his expression troubled. They will return, and next time they will not give warnings. I know. Eli watched the riders disappear down the valley. But at least we bought some time. That night, none of them slept well. They took turns on watch, weapons always within reach, jumping at every sound. The cabin felt less like a home and more like a prison under siege. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week. The tension became a living thing, wearing on them, fraying nerves and shortening tempers. They snapped at each other over small things, then apologized, everyone understanding that fear was the real enemy. Then, on the 8th day, a lone rider appeared. He came from the north, riding slowly with his hands visible and empty, a gesture of peace, or at least non-aggression. As he drew closer, Eli could see he was older, perhaps 50, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the cabin and called out, My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm an attorney from Helena. I'd like to speak with Eli Thorn if he's amenable to conversation. Eli stepped out, rifle in hand. I'm Eli Thorn. May I approach? I give you my word I'm not armed, and I mean no harm. Eli studied the man, reading his body language, his expression. After a moment he nodded. Come ahead, but keep your hands where I can see them. Whitfield dismounted and walked forward with careful, measured steps. Up close, his face was intelligent and weathered, his eyes carrying the shrewd calculation of a man who made his living with words rather than weapons. Mr. Thorn, I've been retained by several parties who have an interest in resolving this situation peacefully. May we speak privately? Anything you have to say, you can say in front of my friends. Wei and Tao Lin had emerged from the cabin, weapons ready but not aimed. Whitfield glanced at them, then nodded. Very well. I'll be direct. Silas Crane wants this land. He's prepared to offer you $500 to vacate immediately, along with safe passage to any destination you choose, and a guarantee that no charges will be pressed for your resistance to his representatives. And if I refuse? Then Crane will use every legal and quasi-legal means at his disposal to remove you. He owns the territorial judge, half the law enforcement, and most of the local businesses. He can make it impossible for you to buy supplies, work, or exist in this region, and that's before we discuss the physical threats his less scrupulous employees might pose. Eli felt anger rising hot in his chest. So my choices are take his money and run, or be driven out by force. I'm afraid that's the reality of the situation, yes. There's a third option, which is, I stay. I defend my right to be here, and I make it so costly for Crane to remove me that he decides it's not worth the effort. Whitfield's expression shifted, not surprise exactly, but a kind of reassessment. You understand you're talking about open conflict with one of the most powerful men in the territory? That he has resources you can't match? Resources don't mean much when the person you're fighting has nothing left to lose. An admirable sentiment, but sentiment doesn't stop bullets or legal writs. Whitfield paused. May I speak candidly? Haven't you been? Not entirely. The truth is, I don't like Silas Crane. I think he's a predator who's built his empire on the backs of people who couldn't fight back. But I'm a realist, and I've seen what happens to those who oppose him. They don't win. They suffer, and they lose, and sometimes they die. I took this job because I thought I could broker a peaceful resolution that would spare you that fate. Your concern is touching, but I'm not interested in being saved from consequences I chose. Whitfield studied him for a long moment. You remind me of someone I knew once, a young woman who fought a mining company that was poisoning her town's water. She was brave, principled, absolutely certain she was right. They destroyed her anyway, ruined her reputation, drove her family into poverty, eventually broke her spirit so completely that she took her own life. His voice softened. Courage is admirable, Mr. Thorn, but it's not always enough. The words hit Eli harder than he expected, stirring memories of his own mother, of watching her fight and lose and finally collapse under the weight of a world that wouldn't bend. But he pushed the memories down and met Whitfield's eyes. Maybe she would have lived if more people had stood with her instead of letting her fight alone. Perhaps. Or perhaps she would have simply pulled them down with her. Whitfield reached into his coat, slowly telegraphing the movement, and pulled out a folded document. This is the offer in writing. $500, safe passage, clean break. It's valid for 72 hours. After that, Crane will pursue other options. He placed the document on the porch railing and stepped back. I hope you'll consider it carefully, Mr. Thorn. Pride is a luxury men in our position can't afford. He mounted his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. Eli picked up the document and read it, then handed it to Wei and Tao Lin. They passed it between them in silence, each reading the carefully worded language that was both an offer and a threat. What will you do? Tao Lin asked finally. Eli looked out at the valley, the mountains rising on all sides, the creek cutting through the snow, the cabin that had sheltered him through the worst winter of his life. He thought about the months of solitude, the peace he'd found here, the small community he'd built with these two men who understood what it meant to be cast out and to fight for a place to exist. I'm staying, he said quietly. And if Crane wants this land, he's going to have to take it from my dead hands. Wei smiled, a fierce, defiant expression. Then we fight together. Together, Tao Lin agreed. They stood on the porch as twilight fell, three outcasts who'd found each other in the wilderness and decided that some things were worth defending, even against impossible odds. The fight was coming, they all knew it, but for the first time in any of their lives, they wouldn't face it alone. And that made all the difference. The 72 hours passed like water through cupped hands. They used the time to fortify their position further, to prepare for what they all knew was coming. Wei dug trenches around the cabin's perimeter, creating cover positions they could use if gunfire erupted. Tao Lin gathered stones from the creek and stacked them into low walls that could stop bullets while allowing return fire. Eli inventoried their ammunition, enough for a sustained fight, but not enough for a prolonged siege. We should consider rationing water, Tao Lin said on the second evening, his voice clinical and detached. If they surround us, the creek becomes inaccessible. We have perhaps 3 days of drinking water if we're careful. They won't wait 3 days, Wei said. He was cleaning his rifle for the third time that day, his movements precise and methodical. Men like Crane don't have patience. They'll come hard and fast, expecting us to break immediately. Eli stood at the window, watching the valley entrance. The sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of copper and blood. What if we're wrong? What if Whitfield was bluffing, trying to scare us into taking the money? Do you believe that? Tao Lin asked. No. Neither do I. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll. He'd given the bed to Tao Lin, whose old bones needed the comfort more, and stared at the ceiling, thinking about all the choices that had led him to this moment. Running from home at 17, binding his chest and cutting his hair, learning to move through the world as someone he wasn't born to be. The years of fear, of constant vigilance, of building walls around himself so high that even he couldn't see over them sometimes. And now here he was, about to fight and possibly die for a patch of frozen ground in the middle of nowhere, alongside two men he'd known for mere months. It should have felt insane. It should have felt like another mistake in a long line of mistakes. Instead, It felt like the first truly honest thing he'd done in years. "You are awake," Taolin's voice came soft from the darkness. "Can't quiet my mind. Fear is a noisy companion." Eli heard the old man shift on the bed, the creak of wood and rope. "You're not afraid?" "I am terrified," Taolin said simply. "But I'm also old enough to know that fear and action are not opposites. We can be afraid and still do what must be done." "What if what must be done is impossible?" "Then we attempt the impossible and see what happens. The outcome is less important than the attempt itself." Eli rolled onto his side, able to make out Taolin's silhouette in the faint moonlight filtering through the shutters. "You said you were a soldier. Did you ever face something like this?" "Many times. War is rarely about the grand battles people remember. Mostly it is small groups of frightened people trying to survive against forces larger than themselves." He paused. "I fought in the Taiping Rebellion. Do you know of it?" "No." "It was a civil war that consumed my country for 14 years. Millions died. More than died in your American Civil War, though few here know of it. I was conscripted at 19, fought until I was 27. I saw things that still visit me in dreams. Cities burned, children starved, men executed for holding the wrong beliefs." His voice grew distant. "When it ended, I had nothing. No family, no home, no future. So I came here, thinking perhaps in America I could start fresh. Instead, I found different masters, different wars, but the same fundamental truth." "What truth?" "That power always seeks to crush those who have none, and that the only way to resist is to refuse to be crushed, even when resistance seems futile." Wei's voice joined from his bedroll near the stove. "My father used to say that a man's worth is measured not by what he achieves, but by what he refuses to accept." "Your father was wise," Taolin said. "He was also dead by 40, worked to death in fields that never belonged to him." Wei's tone was bitter. "Wisdom doesn't feed families or stop powerful men from taking what they want." "No," Eli agreed, "but maybe it helps us understand why we fight anyway." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the valley like a chorus of ghosts. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack, a lonely, defiant sound that seemed to echo their own situation. Dawn brought riders, not 6 this time, but 12. They came from 2 directions simultaneously, 8 from the south, 4 from the east, a coordinated approach meant to divide attention and create panic. But Eli had anticipated this, had planned for it during the long watches of the night. "Wei, take the east window," he called, his voice sharp and clear. "Taolin, south. I'll float between positions." They moved with practiced efficiency, each to their assigned station. Through the shuttered windows, Eli could see the riders spreading out, creating a loose perimeter around the cabin. They stayed just out of effective rifle range, professionals who understood the geometry of violence. The scarred man from the first visit was there again, sitting tall on his horse. He had a white flag tied to a stick, the universal symbol of parley, but his other hand rested on his pistol grip. "Eli Thorn," he shouted, "time's up. Come out peaceable, and you can still walk away from this." Eli cracked open a shutter. "I gave you my answer already. That was before you understood the situation. Look around you, boy. We got you surrounded. You can't win this." "Maybe not, but I can make it expensive." The scarred man's face twisted with frustration. "You're willing to die for this? For what? A cabin and some sheep?" Eli felt something crystallize in his chest, a clarity he'd never experienced before. "I'm willing to die for the right to exist on my own terms, for the right to not be pushed around by men who think power gives them ownership of everything and everyone. You tell Crane he can have this land when I'm dead and not a second before." "That can be arranged." The scarred man lowered the white flag. "Last chance, Thorn." "Go to hell!" The scarred man wheeled his horse around and barked orders. The riders began to move, closing the distance in careful increments, weapons drawn. This was it. The moment when words ended and violence began. "Hold fire until I give the word," Eli said quietly. His heart was hammering, but his hands were steady on the rifle. "Let them think we're paralyzed by fear. Let them get confident." The riders moved closer, 50 yards, 40, 35. Now! 3 rifles spoke as one. 2 riders went down immediately, their horses screaming and bolting. The others scattered, returning fire, bullets thudding into the cabin walls and splintering through shutters. Eli ducked as wood exploded near his head, then rose and fired again, working the bolt action with mechanical precision. Another rider fell, clutching his shoulder. "They're trying to flank," Wei shouted, firing rapidly at shapes moving through the trees on the east side. Eli ran to that window, saw 4 riders using the forest as cover, dismounting to advance on foot. Smarter than he'd hoped. He aimed carefully and fired. Missed, fired again. One of the flanking men went down hard. The battle dissolved into chaos. Gunfire echoed through the valley. Smoke filled the cabin, the acrid smell of burnt powder mixing with the coppery scent of fear sweat. Eli moved between windows, firing, reloading, firing again. His world narrowed to sight picture and trigger pull, and the desperate mathematics of survival. A bullet punched through the wall near Tao Lin's position, and the old man staggered back. "I am hit!" Wei was there in an instant, pulling Tao Lin away from the window. "How bad?" "My arm. Not serious, but I cannot shoot." Eli's mind raced. 2 shooters against 12. No, against 9 now. He could see 3 bodies in the snow, but 9 was still impossible odds, and they had limited ammunition, and Crane's men could simply wait them out, unless he changed the equation. "Cover me," Eli said, making a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. "I'm going out." "What?" Wei stared at him. "That's insane." "They expect us to stay defensive. They're positioning for a siege. I go out, hit them from an angle they're not prepared for. Maybe I can break their formation. Or you can get killed. I'm dead anyway if I stay here." Eli was already moving, grabbing extra ammunition, checking his knife. "When I open the door, you pour fire into the south group. Keep them pinned. I'll circle through the trees and hit them from the side." Tao Lin gripped Eli's shoulder with his good hand, his eyes fierce despite the pain. "Come back alive." "I'll try." Eli positioned himself at the door, took 3 deep breaths, then nodded to Wei. The young man moved to the window and began firing as fast as he could work the bolt. Eli threw open the door and ran. The world exploded into motion and noise. Bullets kicked up snow around his feet as he sprinted toward the tree line, zigzagging, making himself as difficult to target as possible. He felt something hot crease his thigh, but didn't stop, didn't slow, just ran with everything he had until the trees swallowed him and he was in shadow and cover. He kept moving, circling wide, using the forest skills he'd learned during the winter. The gunfire from the cabin was continuous now. Wei was burning through ammunition to keep the riders focused that direction. Eli could hear men shouting, coordinating, moving toward the cabin for a final assault. He found his position behind a fallen log and assessed the situation. 6 riders were advancing on the cabin from the south, using cover and movement tactics, getting closer with each bound. They were professionals, disciplined, and they were going to overwhelm Wei's position within minutes. Eli raised his rifle, sighted on the rearmost rider, and fired. The man dropped. The other spun, confused, trying to locate this new threat. Eli fired again, missed, adjusted, fired a 3rd time. Another man went down screaming. Now the riders were caught in a crossfire, taking shots from the cabin and from the forest. Their formation broke as panic set in. 2 of them ran for their horses. Eli dropped one before he reached his mount. The other made it into the saddle and fled down the valley at a full gallop. The scarred leader was shouting orders, trying to rally his men, but the advantage was lost. Eats. 3 more riders broke and ran, abandoning the fight. That left only the scarred man and one other, a huge brute with a shotgun, who seemed too stubborn or too stupid to retreat. Eli reloaded and started moving again, closing the distance while they were disorganized. He could see the scarred man scanning the trees, trying to spot him. The big man with the shotgun was firing blindly into the forest, the booms of his weapon echoing off the mountains. Then Wei's rifle cracked from the cabin, and the big man went down, his shotgun spinning away into the snow. The scarred man looked around at the carnage. 7 of his men dead or wounded, the rest fled. His attack turned into a disaster. His eyes found Eli emerging from the tree line, rifle leveled at his chest. "Drop your weapon," Eli said. For a moment he thought the scarred man would fight, would go for his pistol in a final desperate act. But something in Eli's eyes must have convinced him otherwise. He raised his hand slowly. "You got steel in you, boy. I'll give you that. Get off this land. Tell Crane that if he wants it, he'll have to come himself, and he'll need more than hired guns." The scarred man spat blood into the snow. "You think you won something here today? You just signed your death warrant. Crane will send the territorial marshal. He'll send the army if he has to. You can't fight the whole goddamn government." "Maybe not, but I can make them remember they had to fight at all." The scarred man stared at him for a long moment, then laughed, a bitter, defeated sound. "You're crazier than I thought, but you got guts, more than most." He turned and walked toward his horse, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible. He mounted up and looked back one last time. "When they come for you next time, it won't be with warning shots and mercy. It'll be with everything they got. I'm counting on it." The rider shook his head and rode away, leaving the dead and wounded behind. Eli stood in the snow, rifle still raised, watching until the rider disappeared. Then his legs went weak and he sat down hard, the adrenaline draining from his body all at once. His hands started shaking. The crease on his thigh was bleeding, soaking his pants with red. He touched it with numb fingers, felt the hot sting of the wound, and realized how close he'd come to dying. "Eli!" Wei was running toward him, Tao Lin hobbling behind despite his wounded arm. "Are you hurt?" "Just a graze. I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're bleeding." Wei knelt beside him, already pulling cloth from his pocket to bind the wound. "That was the most reckless thing I've ever seen anyone do." "It worked, though." "It could have gotten you killed." "But it didn't." Eli managed a weak smile. "We won." Tao Lin reached them, his face pale but his eyes bright. "We won a battle. The war is just beginning." The old man was right, and they all knew it. They spent the rest of the day dealing with the aftermath, checking the fallen men for signs of life, finding two still breathing and binding their wounds despite everything, dragging the bodies away from the cabin, collecting abandoned weapons and ammunition. It was grim, exhausting work that left all of them hollow and shaken. That evening, they sat around the stove in silence, each processing what they'd done. Eli had killed men today, 3 for certain, possibly more. He waited for guilt or horror to arrive, but all he felt was a strange numbness. These men had come to drive him from his home, to destroy everything he'd built. They'd made their choice, and he'd made his. "Do you think they'll come back?" Wei asked quietly. "Yes," Tao Lin said. "The scarred one was correct. Crane cannot allow this defeat to stand. He will escalate." "Then we need allies," Eli said. "We can't fight the territorial government alone." "Who would stand with us?" Wei's voice was skeptical. "We are nobodies, outcasts. The people of Red Hollow won't risk Crane's wrath for us. Maybe not all of them, but there are others like us, people who've been pushed around, who've lost land or loved ones to Crane's expansion. If we can find them, convince them to stand together." "That is a dangerous hope," Tao Lin warned. "Unity requires trust, and trust is a rare commodity in this territory. So we make it less rare." Eli stood, wincing as his wounded leg protested. "Tomorrow, I ride back to Red Hollow. I talk to people. I see who might be willing to fight." "They tried to burn us out," Wei said. "What makes you think they won't try again while you're gone?" "Because they're regrouping, same as us, and because I don't think Crane expected real resistance. He'll need time to plan his next move." Eli looked at his companions. "Besides, you two can hold this position better than most, and I won't be gone long." The ride back to Red Hollow the next morning felt surreal. The town looked exactly as Eli had left it months ago. The same mud-churned streets, the same desperate men moving like wolves, the same atmosphere of barely controlled violence. But Eli himself had changed. The person who'd ridden into the mountains alone and afraid was not the same person who rode back down scarred and steady. He went first to the boarding house, to Maggie. The hard-faced woman looked up from her counter and actually smiled, a rare expression that transformed her features. "Eli Thorn, heard you were dead." "Not yet." "Heard you shot up some of Crane's boys, too. That true?" "They came at me first. I just returned the favor." Maggie studied him with new respect. "You got more sand than I gave you credit for. Dutch is looking for you, said to send you his way if you showed up alive." Eli found Keller at the supply depot, shouting at workers who were loading wagons with characteristic efficiency born of fear. When Keller saw Eli, he stopped mid-sentence and stared. Jesus Christ, kid, you really did it. Did what? Stood up to Crane. Words all over town. His men came back shot to pieces, 3 dead, talking about some crazy bastard in the mountains who wouldn't be moved. Keller shook his head in disbelief. I didn't think you had it in you. Neither did I, if I'm being honest. Keller gestured for Eli to follow him into the depot office, away from listening ears. Once inside with the door closed, his expression turned serious. You know what you've started, don't you? I know what I'm fighting. Whether I started it or Crane did is debatable. Not to Crane it ain't. He sees you as an insult, a challenge to his authority. He can't let it stand. Good. Let him come. I'll keep fighting until he gets tired of losing men. It's not that simple. Crane's got the territorial marshal in his pocket. Man named Pike, mean as a snake and twice as venomous. Pike can declare you an outlaw, put a bounty on your head, make it legal to hunt you down like an animal. Eli felt cold settle in his stomach but kept his voice steady. Then I'll be an outlaw. Won't be the first time I've lived outside the law. Keller looked at him for a long moment. You remind me of someone I knew in the war. Confederate officer, stubborn as hell, wouldn't retreat even when it was the smart move. Got himself killed at Gettysburg, charging up Cemetery Ridge with nothing but a pistol and pure spite. He paused. I respected the hell out of that man. I also thought he was a damned fool. Maybe I am a fool. But I'm a fool who's still breathing. For now. Keller moved to a desk and pulled out a bottle of whiskey, poured 2 glasses. He pushed one toward Eli. Here's the thing, kid. I may have sold that land to pay debts, but I didn't sell my conscience. Crane's a cancer on this territory, and I'm tired of watching him spread. So I'm going to tell you something that could get me killed if the wrong people hear about it. Eli took the glass but didn't drink. I'm listening. There's a meeting tomorrow night. Old mine shaft about 5 miles east of here. A group of landowners and miners who've all been squeezed by Crane in one way or another. They've been talking about organizing, about pushing back. You show up and tell your story, you might find more allies than you expect. Why tell me this? Because you already did what they've all been too scared to do. You drew blood. That matters. That shows it's possible to fight back and survive. Keller raised his glass. To stubborn fools and the trouble they cause. Eli clinked glasses with him and drank. The whiskey burned going down, warming his chest and steadying his nerves. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This could all blow up in spectacular fashion, but at least it'll be interesting to watch. The meeting the following night was held in the abandoned mine shaft Keller had described. A dangerous location, half collapsed and filled with bad air, but private and defendable. Eli arrived early, leading his horse through the darkness, and found 11 people already gathered around a small fire built far enough back in the shaft that the light wouldn't be visible from outside. They looked up as he entered, faces hard and suspicious in the flickering light. Most were men, miners and small landholders with the weathered look of people who'd fought the land for every scrap of survival. But there were 2 women as well, one older with iron gray hair and calloused hands, one younger with a rifle slung across her back and eyes that had seen too much violence. Keller was there, and he stood when Eli entered. This is Eli Thorn, the one I told you about. The kid who shot up Crane's men. The speaker was a barrel-chested miner with a scarred face and suspicious eyes. Heard different versions of that story. Some say it was self-defense. Some say you ambushed them. They came to my land with torches and guns, Eli said simply. I defended myself and my home. That's all there is to it. And killed 3 men doing it. They made their choice. I made mine. The older woman spoke up, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being heard. I'm Martha Hendricks. I owned a ranch 15 miles south of here before Crane's men burned it to force me to sell. Lost my husband in the fire. Her eyes were hard as flint. If you're here looking for sympathy, you won't find it. But if you're here to fight, I'm listening. Eli met her gaze. I'm here because fighting alone gets you killed. I'm here because I think there are enough people who've been hurt by Crane that we could actually make a difference if we stand together. Pretty words, the barrel-chested miner said, but words don't stop bullets or legal writs. No, but enough people refusing to back down might make Crane think twice about who he targets next. A thin man with a nervous manner spoke up, You don't understand what you're dealing with. Crane owns the marshal. He owns the judge. He owns most of the businesses in 3 counties. He can make people disappear without consequence. I understand perfectly. He tried to make me disappear. I'm still here. For now. But how long can you last? A week? A month? Eventually he'll wear you down or kill you outright. Maybe. Or maybe if enough of us fight back, we make it too expensive for him to continue. Bullies rely on people being too scared to resist. Take away the fear, and the bully loses power. The younger woman with the rifle spoke for the first time. My name's Sarah Coltrane. Crane's men killed my brother when he wouldn't sell his mining claim. Said it was an accident, but everyone knows it was murder. She looked around the group. I've spent the last 6 months wanting to put a bullet in Silas Crane myself, but knowing I'd hang for it if I tried. But if there's a way to fight back that doesn't end with a noose, I'm in. Others began to speak, sharing their stories. A Chinese laborer whose contract Crane owned, who was worked like a slave with no hope of freedom. A merchant whose store was driven out of business when Crane opened a competing shop and undercut his prices until he went bankrupt. A widow whose land was seized through legal manipulation she couldn't afford to fight. A prospector who discovered gold only to have his claim stolen through forged documents. Each story was different, but they all had the same core. People ground down by a system that favored the powerful and crushed the weak, who'd been taught that resistance was futile and that their only option was to accept their fate. Eli listened to them all, and when they finished, he spoke. I can't promise we'll win. I can't promise any of us will survive what's coming, but I can promise that if we fight together, we'll make Crane remember us. We'll make him pay a price for every inch of ground he takes, and maybe, just maybe, we'll inspire other people in other places to stand up too. That's a suicide pact, the nervous man said. Maybe, but it's better than dying on your knees. Silence fell over the group. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the mine walls. Eli could see them weighing the cost, calculating odds, wrestling with hope and fear. Finally, Martha Hendricks spoke. I'm in. I've got nothing left to lose anyway. I'm in too, Sarah said. One by one, they committed. Some with fierce determination, some with quiet resignation, all of them understanding that this was a choice that couldn't be undone. By the time the meeting ended, Eli had 13 allies, which wasn't nearly enough, but was infinitely more than he'd had before. They made plans, established communication methods, agreed to meet again in 3 days to coordinate their next moves. And as Eli rode back toward the mountain cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not hope exactly. Hope was too fragile a thing for what was coming, but purpose, direction, the sense that he was finally fighting for something larger than just his own survival. He reached the cabin as the sun was rising, found Wei and Tao Lin waiting anxiously. He told them everything and watched their expressions shift from concern to cautious optimism. 13 people, Wei said. Against Crane's entire operation, those are terrible odds. They were worse when it was just 3 of us, Eli pointed out. This is true. Tao Lin's wounded arm was healing well, the old man's resilience proving stronger than his age suggested. But organization requires trust, and trust requires time we may not have. Then we'll have to build it faster than normal. Over the next week, Eli's makeshift alliance began to take shape. Martha Hendricks proved to be a natural leader, organizing the scattered members into effective groups. Sarah Coltrane was a crackshot who began training others in marksmanship. Keller used his position in town to gather intelligence on Crane's movements and plans. And through it all, rumors began to spread through the territory. Whispers of resistance, of people standing up, of Crane's supposedly unbreakable power showing cracks. But Crane wasn't idle either. The territorial marshal arrived in Red Hollow with a warrant for Eli's arrest on charges of murder, assault, and insurrection. The bounty was $500, enough money to make every desperate man in the territory start calculating odds. Eli heard about it from Keller, who rode to the cabin with the news looking pale and shaken. Pike's declared you an outlaw. Says anyone who harbors you or helps you is complicit in your crimes. He's deputized 20 men, and he's coming for you. Eli felt the old fear trying to resurface, but pushed it down. When? 3 days? Maybe 4? He's gathering forces, making a show of due process to give his hunt legal cover. Then we have 3 days to prepare. Eli looked at Wei and Tao Lin, saw his own determination reflected in their faces. We fought before. We'll fight again. This is different, Keller warned. Pike won't come with hired guns. He'll come with the law behind him, with men who believe they're doing the right thing. Killing them makes you a murderer in truth, not just in Crane's propaganda. Then we don't kill them. We hold them off. We make it too costly to continue, and we hope the rest of our people are causing enough trouble elsewhere that Crane has to divide his attention. Keller shook his head. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most delusional. I genuinely can't tell which. Can it be both? Despite the tension, Keller laughed. Get some rest, kid. You're going to need it. That night, as Eli lay in his bedroll staring at the ceiling, he thought about everything that had led to this moment. All the running, all the hiding, all the years of being someone he wasn't just to survive. And now here he was, about to make his final stand not as the person the world wanted him to be, but as the person he'd chosen to become. He reached under his shirt and felt the binding, still there, still necessary, still the secret that could destroy everything if revealed at the wrong moment. But somehow it felt less like a prison now, and more like armor. A reminder that he'd survived impossible things before and could survive them again. Outside, the wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the promise of the storm to come. Part 1. Lưu ý. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa, lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Tri dân bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí, không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu. 3 days became 2, then 1, and the waiting pressed down on them like a physical weight. Eli stood on the cabin porch in the pale dawn light, watching the valley entrance with eyes that burned from lack of sleep. Behind him, Wei was checking weapons for the dozenth time, his movements mechanical and precise. Tao Lin sat near the stove, his wounded arm now mostly healed, sharpening a blade with long, methodical strokes that filled the silence with a sound like whispered warnings. They will come today, Tao Lin said, without looking up from his work. I can feel it in the air. How can you tell? Wei asked. Experience. Before a battle, the world grows still. The bird stops singing. The wind holds its breath. Nature knows when violence is coming. Eli listened and realized the old man was right. The valley was too quiet, the morning too calm. Even the sheep seemed nervous, huddled together in tight groups instead of spreading out to graze. We should eat, Eli said, though his stomach churned at the thought. No telling when we'll get another chance. They forced down a cold breakfast of hardtack and dried meat, washing it down with bitter coffee that tasted like ashes. Nobody spoke much. What was there to say that hadn't already been said in the long nights of planning and preparation? They knew the odds. They knew what was coming. Words wouldn't change any of it. It was mid-morning when the dust appeared on the southern trail. Eli counted riders through the spyglass Keller had provided. 23 men, heavily armed, moving with the disciplined formation of a military unit. At their head rode a tall figure in a long black coat, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. Even from this distance, Eli could feel the man's authority, the casual certainty of someone who'd never been told no and didn't expect to start now. That's Pike, Wei said, looking through his own glass. The marshal, the one with the black coat. He looks like death itself, Tao Lin observed. The comparison was apt. Marshal Pike rode like a man conducting a funeral procession, somber and inevitable. Behind him came his deputies, rough men with the hard eyes of those who'd killed before and would kill again without hesitation. But there were others too, younger men with nervous expressions. Probably local recruits promised money and glory for what Pike was selling as simple law enforcement. The posse stopped about 100 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. Pike dismounted and walked forward alone, stopping at 50 yards. He pulled out a piece of paper and held it up. "Eli Thorn!" His voice was deep and carried easily across the distance. "I hold a warrant for your arrest on charges of murder, assault, and insurrection against the territorial government. You will surrender yourself immediately or be taken by force." Eli stepped out onto the porch, rifle held loosely in his hands. "I acted in self-defense. Crane's men came to burn me out. I have the right to protect my home. This land doesn't belong to you. It belongs to Silas Crane by legal purchase. You are a squatter and a murderer." Pike's voice never rose, never showed emotion. He spoke with the flat certainty of scripture. "You have 5 minutes to surrender. After that, we come in." "I'm not surrendering to Crane's puppet. I am a duly appointed officer of the territorial government. My authority supersedes your delusions of righteousness." Pike checked a pocket watch. 5 minutes, Mr. Thorn. Use them wisely." The marshal walked back to his horse with measured steps, mounted up, and began issuing orders to his men. They spread out, taking positions behind rocks and trees, setting up for a siege. Professional, disciplined, exactly what Eli had feared. Way appeared at his shoulder. "We can't fight 23 men. This is suicide." "Maybe, but Martha and the others should be making their moves right now. If we can hold Pike here long enough, keep his attention focused on us instead of what's happening in Red Hollow. That assumes they haven't been arrested already. That assumes Crane hasn't anticipated everything." "I know." Eli felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. So much depended on people he barely knew, on plans that could fall apart at the first contact with reality. But what choice did they have? Surrender meant a noose or at best a cell for the rest of his life. And either option would expose his secret, would strip away the identity he'd fought so hard to build. Better to die here as Eli Thorn than live exposed as something the world would never accept. The 5 minutes passed. Pike raised his hand, and his men opened fire. The cabin erupted with the sound of bullets hitting wood, shattering glass, punching through shutters. Eli dove inside as splinters exploded where he'd been standing. Y was already at the south window returning fire, his rifle cracking in steady rhythm. Tao Lin had taken the east position, his old soldier's instincts guiding his movements. "Conserve ammunition," Eli shouted over the noise. "Make every shot count." He took up position at the west window, scanning for targets. Pike's men were good. They used cover effectively, advanced in bounds, while others provided suppressing fire, worked together with the smooth coordination of experienced fighters. These weren't hired thugs like the first group. These were professionals. Eli sighted on a deputy moving between trees and squeezed the trigger. The man went down, clutching his leg. Not a kill shot, but enough to take him out of the fight. Eli worked the bolt and found another target, fired, missed as the man ducked behind a boulder. "They're trying to get around the back," Wei called. "I see movement near the creek." Eli ran to that position, saw 3 men using the creek bed as cover, getting dangerously close. He fired twice, driving them back but not hitting anyone. They'd keep trying. Eventually, they'd find a weak point. The siege settled into a brutal pattern of gunfire and movement, advance and retreat. Pike's men would push forward, take fire, pull back to regroup. They weren't in a hurry. They could afford to be patient, to wear down the defenders through attrition and exhaustion. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun climbed higher, turning the cabin into an oven despite the cold outside. Eli's throat was parched, his ears ringing from constant gunfire, his hands cramping from gripping the rifle. Beside him, Wei was bleeding from a splinter wound to his cheek, and Tao Lin was breathing hard, his face gray with fatigue. "We're running low on ammunition," Wei said during a brief lull. "Maybe 20 rounds left." "Same here," Eli admitted. They'd brought as much as they could carry, but against 23 men it wasn't nearly enough. At this rate, they'd be out in another hour, maybe less. Then everything changed. A massive explosion shook the valley, followed seconds later by another. Eli ran to the south window and saw smoke rising from Red Hollow, 2 distinct columns, black and thick. The gunfire around the cabin faltered as Pike's men turned to look. "What was that?" one of the deputies shouted. Pike had his spyglass out, staring toward town. Even from this distance, Eli could see the tension in the marshal's shoulders. Whatever he was seeing, it wasn't good. A rider appeared on the southern trail, galloping hard, his horse lathered with sweat. He reached Pike and began speaking rapidly, gesturing toward town. Eli couldn't hear the words, but he could read the body language: panic, urgent news, a situation spiraling out of control. Pike listened, his face darkening. Then he called out, "Eli Thorn, we need to talk." Eli stepped to the doorway, keeping the frame between himself and any potential shooters. "I'm listening." "There's been an incident in Red Hollow. 2 buildings destroyed, the land office and Crane's company headquarters. Multiple casualties." Pike's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Your associates, I presume." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't insult my intelligence. This was coordinated, timed to coincide with this siege." Pike moved his horse forward a few steps. "But you've made a serious mistake. Crane's daughter was in that headquarters building. If she's dead, there's no force on earth that will save you from what's coming." Eli felt ice form in his stomach. Martha and the others were supposed to target infrastructure, supplies, empty buildings. They weren't supposed to hurt civilians, especially not Crane's family. If they had... "I never ordered anyone hurt," Eli called back. "If people are dead, that's on whoever set those explosions, not me. The law doesn't distinguish. You started this rebellion. You're responsible for everything that follows." Pike was gathering his men now, preparing to withdraw. "I'm pulling back to deal with the situation in town. But this isn't over, Thorn, not by a long shot. When I come back, I'm bringing the army, and there won't be any more chances to surrender." The posse mounted up and rode hard toward Red Hollow, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Eli watched them go, his mind racing. Crane's daughter. If she was dead, if Martha and the others had crossed that line, everything changed. The territory would unite against them. The federal government would get involved. They'd gone from outlaws to terrorists in the span of a heartbeat. "We need to get to town," Wei said. "Find out what really happened." "It could be a trap," Tao Lin warned. "Pike could be trying to draw us out." "Then it's a trap we have to walk into." Eli was already moving, grabbing supplies, checking weapons. "Because if our people did something that terrible, we need to know. And if they didn't, if this is Crane's manipulation, we need to expose it before the whole territory turns against us." They rode hard toward Red Hollow, following the same trail Pike's posse had taken. As they got closer, the smoke grew thicker, and Eli could hear shouting, the sound of men fighting fires, the chaos of a town in crisis. They entered Red Hollow from the east, avoiding the main street. The destruction was worse than Eli had imagined. The land office was completely destroyed, reduced to smoking rubble. Crane's company headquarters was half collapsed, its front wall blown out, bodies being pulled from the wreckage by grim-faced men. Eli found Keller near the supply depot, his face blackened with soot, his hands burned from fighting fires. "What happened?" Eli demanded. Keller grabbed his arm and pulled him into an alley, away from listening ears. It was Martha. She and Sarah Coltrane rigged explosives in both buildings, set them to go off simultaneously. They were supposed to wait until nightfall when the buildings would be empty, but something went wrong. The charges went early, during business hours. "How many dead?" 7 confirmed, more wounded. And yeah, Crane's daughter was in the headquarters, 22 years old, there to review accounts. Keller's voice was hollow. "She's alive, but barely. Lost a leg, crushed ribs, burns all over. The doctor says even if she survives, she'll never be the same." Eli felt sick. "Where's Martha now?" "She and Sarah ran, took horses, and headed north toward the Canadian border. Pike sending men after them, but they had a head start." Keller met Eli's eyes. "This changes everything. You were a troublesome outlaw before. Now you're the leader of a terrorist movement. Crane won't stop until everyone associated with you is dead or in chains. I didn't order this. I specifically said no civilian casualties. Doesn't matter what you ordered. You inspired them, recruited them, pointed them at targets. In the eyes of the law, you're responsible." Keller pulled out a flask and took a long drink, then offered it to Eli. "There's more. Crane himself is coming. He was in Helena when he got word about his daughter. He's riding back with a company of territorial militia, maybe 50 men, and he's not interested in arrests or trials. He wants blood. Wei had been listening, his face pale. Then we need to leave, now, while we still can. And go where? Eli asked bitterly. We're marked men. Every lawman in the territory will be hunting us, every bounty hunter, every desperate fool who wants that reward money. So what do you propose? That we stay and die? I propose we face this head on. We find Martha and Sarah, we figure out what really happened, and we expose the truth. The truth doesn't matter anymore, Keller said. Public opinion has already turned. People are scared. They see explosions and dead bodies, and they want someone to blame. You're the convenient target. Tao Lin, who'd been silent until now, spoke up. There is another possibility. What if this was not a mistake? What if Martha and Sarah were manipulated into Han to attacking early? Everyone turned to look at him. Think about it, the old man continued. Martha is experienced, careful. She would not make such an obvious error. But what if someone discovered the plan and altered the timing? What if Crane himself triggered the explosions early, ensuring maximum casualties and his daughter's presence in the building? That's insane, Wei said. No one would sacrifice their own child for political advantage. Are you certain? Men like Crane view everything as assets and liabilities. Perhaps he saw his daughter as expendable if her sacrifice could justify eliminating all opposition permanently. Eli felt a chill run through him. It was a horrifying thought, but it made a terrible kind of sense. Crane had already shown he'd kill without hesitation. Why not orchestrate an atrocity and blame it on his enemies, turning public opinion against them while giving himself moral justification for total war? How would we prove it? Eli asked. The timing devices, Tao Lin said. If they were tampered with, there would be evidence. And someone had to know about the plan to alter it, a spy among our group, or perhaps someone watching Martha and Sarah. Keller nodded slowly. The explosives expert who sold Martha the dynamite, man named Cooper. He's still in town. If anyone would know about the devices, it'd be him. They found Cooper in his shop at the edge of town, a nervous little man with powder-stained hands and eyes that darted like a cornered animal. When he saw Eli, he tried to run, but Wei was faster, blocking the door. We just want to talk, Eli said, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency burning in his chest. I don't know nothing. I just sell supplies. What people do with them ain't my business. You sold Martha Hendricks dynamite and timing devices. We need to know if anyone else asked about them. If anyone might have accessed them before she used them. Cooper's eyes went even wider. You think I'm stupid? You think I'm going to tell you anything when Crane's men are looking for anyone connected to this? Eli pulled out the last of his money, $40 that represented everything he had left, and placed it on the counter. This isn't about threats. This is about finding the truth. If Martha was set up, don't you want to know? Don't you want to make sure Crane doesn't get away with manipulating her into killing innocent people? Cooper stared at the money, then at Eli, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he grabbed the bills and shoved them in his pocket. There was someone. Came in 2 days after Martha bought her supplies. Said he was her partner, needed to check the devices to make sure they were set right. I didn't think nothing of it at the time. What did he look like? Big fellow, scarred face, one of Crane's regular men. I've seen him around town. The scarred man from the first attack, the one who'd led the riders against Eli's cabin. It all clicked into place with horrible clarity. He changed the timers, Eli said. Set them to go off during business hours instead of at night. Made it look like Martha was targeting civilians. That's my guess, Cooper said, but I can't prove it. He knew what he was doing, wouldn't have left evidence. But you can testify. You can tell people what you saw. Cooper laughed bitterly. And get myself killed? No thanks. I told you because you paid me and because maybe part of me feels bad about what happened. But I'm not testifying against Silas Crane. I like breathing too much. They left the shop with confirmation, but no usable evidence. Keller was right. The truth didn't matter if they couldn't prove it, and even proof might not be enough against the tide of public anger and fear. We need to find Martha and Sarah, Eli said as they made their way back through the alleys. They're the only ones who can corroborate what happened. If we can get their testimony, combine it with Cooper's reluctant confirmation, maybe we can... A gunshot cracked the air, and Wei went down with a cry of pain. Eli spun, saw the scarred man standing in the alley entrance with a smoking pistol. Behind him were 4 more of Crane's men, all armed, all grinning with the anticipation of violence. "End of the road, Thorn," the scarred man said. "Crane wants you alive if possible, but dead works just fine too." Eli dropped into cover behind a water trough, pulling Wei with him. The young man was bleeding from his shoulder, his face twisted in agony. Tao Lin had his pistol out, but 5 against 2 were bad odds, especially with Wei wounded. "You set up Martha," Eli called out, buying time, trying to think. "You changed the timers on those explosives, murdered those people, and blamed it on us." "Prove it," the scarred man said with a shrug. "Oh, wait, you can't. And even if you could, nobody would care. You're the bad guys now. We're just doing our civic duty." He raised his pistol again, but before he could fire, a rifle shot echoed from a rooftop, and one of his men dropped. Then another shot, and another. The scarred man and his remaining companions scattered, diving for cover as bullets rained down from 3 different positions. Sarah Coltrane appeared on the roof across the alley, working her rifle with deadly precision. 2 other figures Eli didn't recognize were firing from adjacent buildings, members of their alliance, come to even the odds. "Go! Come to Shitutacha," Sarah shouted. "We'll cover you! Get out of town!" Eli pulled Wei to his feet, supported his weight as they stumbled toward where they'd left the horses. Tao Lin covered their retreat, firing at anyone who showed themselves. Behind them, the gunfight intensified, echoing through Red Hollow's streets, drawing more men into the chaos. They reached the horses and mounted up, Wei barely able to stay in his saddle. Eli tied him in place with a rope, then looked back toward the town. Smoke was rising from new fires, gunshots crackling like strings of firecrackers. Red Hollow was tearing itself apart, and he was the spark that had lit the fuse. "Ride!" Tao Lin commanded. "Before more come!" They rode hard toward the mountains, Wei's blood leaving a trail behind them. Eli knew they were finished in this territory, knew that everything they'd built was ashes now. But at least they were still alive, still free, still fighting. They made it halfway to the cabin before Wei passed out from blood loss. Eli stopped, cut him down from his horse, laid him on the ground, and tried to staunch the bleeding. But the wound was bad. The bullet lodged deep in his shoulder, and they had no supplies, no doctor, no way to help him. "We have to get him back to the cabin," Eli said desperately. "I have medical supplies there. I can—" "Eli." Tao Lin's voice was gentle but firm. "Look." Eli looked up and saw riders on the horizon behind them, dozens of them, maybe more. Crane's militia, probably, or Pike's deputies, or bounty hunters drawn by the reward. It didn't matter who they were. What mattered was that they were coming, and Eli had no way to outrun them with Wei wounded and dying. "Leave me," Wei gasped, his eyes fluttering open. "Take the horses and go. You can make it if you're alone." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to. I'm dead anyway. But you and Tao Lin, you can still escape. Still fight." Wei's hand found Eli's. "Make them remember. Make them know we existed. Make them understand we weren't monsters." Tears burned Eli's eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I brought you into this." "Don't be. You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to stand up instead of just surviving." Wei smiled weakly. "That matters. That's worth dying for." The riders were getting closer. Eli could hear their horses now, the sound like approaching thunder. Tao Lin touched Eli's shoulder. "We must go. He is right. If we stay, we all die, and no one remembers our story." Eli looked at Wei, this young man who'd become a brother in the months they'd spent fighting side by side, and felt something break inside him. But Wei was right. They were all right. Sometimes surviving meant leaving people behind. Sometimes it meant carrying their memory instead of their body. "I won't forget," Eli promised. "I'll make sure everyone knows what you did, what you stood for." "I know you will." Wei's voice was fading. "Now go, while you still can." Eli stood, Tao Lin already mounted. He climbed onto his own horse, looked back one last time at Wei lying in the snow, and then turned north toward the border and whatever future awaited beyond it. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them as the riders reached Wei's position. Eli didn't look back. He couldn't. If he looked back, he'd turn around, and that would be the end of everything. They rode through the day and into the night, pushing the horses to their limits. Behind them, the pursuit continued, relentless as winter itself. But Eli and Tao Lin knew these mountains, knew the hidden trails and secret passes. They had a chance. Just before dawn, they stopped to rest the horses near a frozen stream. Eli dismounted on shaking legs, his whole body numb from cold and exhaustion and grief. He'd lost way. He'd lost his home. He'd lost everything except his life and the old man who'd become his unlikely companion. "What do we do now?" Eli asked, his voice hollow. Tao Lin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mountains ahead. "We survive. We cross the border. We live to tell this story so that Wei and all the others are not forgotten." He turned to Eli. "And perhaps someday, when the wounds are not so fresh, we find a way to come back, to finish what we started. They'll never stop hunting us? Probably not, but that is the price of defiance. That is the cost of refusing to submit." Tao Lin's eyes were steady, carrying the weight of all his years and all his wars. "You asked me once what I learned from fighting. This is it, that some battles cannot be won, but they must still be fought, because the act of resistance itself changes the world, even if we don't live to see how." Eli thought about Red Hollow, about the people who'd stood with him and paid the price, about Wei dying in the snow, about Martha and Sarah, hunted like animals, about all the small acts of courage that had added up to revolution, even if that revolution had been crushed. Tao Lin was right. They'd lost the battle. Maybe they'd lost the war, but they'd shown that resistance was possible, that ordinary people could stand against power and make it bleed, and that lesson would outlive them all. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of copper and gold, Eli Thorn made a silent promise to the dead and to himself. He would survive. He would remember. And someday, somehow, he would make sure the world knew that they had existed, that they had fought, and that their fight had mattered. The future was uncertain. The past was ashes. But the present moment, this frozen dawn, this borrowed breath, this defiant heartbeat, that belonged to him, and no one could take it away. They crossed into Canada on the third day, half frozen and delirious with exhaustion. The border was nothing more than an invisible line in the wilderness, marked by no fence or guard station, but Eli felt the weight lift from his shoulders the moment Tao Lin pointed to a weathered stone marker half buried in snow and said, "We are beyond their reach now." Beyond their reach. The words should have brought relief, but all Eli felt was emptiness. They'd escaped with their lives, but everything else, their home, their purpose, their hope of changing anything, lay buried in the Montana Territory, along with Wei and the others who'd paid the ultimate price for daring to resist. They found shelter in a trapper's cabin abandoned for the winter, its owner likely gone to warmer territory until spring. Eli collapsed on the floor and didn't move for 16 hours, his body finally claiming the rest it had been denied for days. When he woke, Tao Lin had a fire going and was boiling snow for water, his movements slow and careful, his face carved with new lines of age and weariness. "How long was I out?" Eli asked, his voice rough as gravel. "Nearly a full day. I was beginning to worry you would not wake." Tao Lin handed him a cup of hot water. "We have no food. I will need to hunt soon, or we will starve before spring." Eli drank, the warmth spreading through his chest. "I can help. I know how to trap, how to—" "You need to rest. Your body is at its limit." Tao Lin sat across from him. "Besides, I have been surviving in wilderness longer than you have been alive. I will manage." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind howl outside. Finally, Eli asked the question that had been gnawing at him since they'd crossed the border. "Do you think any of the others made it out?" Tao Lin's expression was grave. "Martha and Sarah had a head start. It is possible they reached Canada ahead of the pursuit. The others—" He shook his head. "I do not know. And we have no way of finding out without exposing ourselves. So we just hide here? Live like ghosts while Crane destroys everyone who stood with us? We survive. That is all we can do for now." "It's not enough." Eli stood, pacing the small cabin despite his exhaustion. Way died believing we'd make people remember, that his sacrifice meant something. But if we just disappear into Canada and never look back, then Crane wins completely. He gets to write the history, make us into monsters, justify everything he did. And what would you have us do? Return to face certain death? No, but maybe there's another way. Eli's mind was racing now, the pieces of a desperate plan beginning to form. Crane's power comes from controlling the narrative. What if we took that away from him? What if we told our story to someone who could spread it beyond his reach? Tao Lin studied him carefully. You're thinking of newspapers, journalists. There are papers in the eastern cities that have been critical of the territorial land grabs, papers that have exposed corruption before. If we could reach one of them, tell them what really happened, about Crane's manipulation, about the scarred man changing the timers, about innocent people being driven from their land, maybe we could turn public opinion. That is a dangerous hope. Journalists can be bought like anyone else. Maybe, but it's the only move we have left. Eli stopped pacing and faced the old man. I'm not asking you to come with me. You've done more than enough. You've earned the right to disappear and live out your days in peace. But I can't do that. Not while Crane gets to sleep easy thinking he's destroyed us completely. Tao Lin was silent for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he smiled, a small, fierce expression. Do you think after everything we have been through, I would let you face this final battle alone? You insult my sense of loyalty. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment you stood up for me in Red Hollow, when no one else would. It became my fight when Wei died in the snow for principles we all shared. It became my fight when I chose to survive instead of surrender. Tao Lin stood and clasped Eli's shoulder. We finish this together, or we do not finish it at all. Over the following weeks, they made their way east through the Canadian wilderness, trading work for food and shelter at isolated settlements, slowly regaining their strength. Tao Lin proved to be a remarkably resourceful traveler, able to find game even in the deepest winter, able to read weather and terrain with the skill of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning to survive against the odds. And during the long nights by campfires and in borrowed barns, Eli told his story to Tao Lin, all of it, including the parts he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. About being born Eliana, about his mother's collapse after his father's death, about the desperate choice to become someone else entirely rather than accept the limited, suffocating future the world offered to someone in a female body. About the years of fear and hiding, the constant performance, the exhausting vigilance required to maintain an identity that felt more real than the one assigned at birth. Tao Lin listened without judgment, his face reflecting only compassion and understanding. When Eli finished, the old man said simply, "The world is full of people who cannot see beyond the narrow definitions they were taught. But that does not make their blindness correct. You are who you know yourself to be, and that truth is more real than any name or body." The words settled into Eli's chest like warm stones, a comfort he hadn't known he needed. For the first time in years, he felt seen, truly seen, not as a deception or a performance, but as a whole person whose complexity was acknowledged rather than denied. They reached Toronto in late April, the city awakening from winter like a sleeper shaking off a long dream. It was larger than any place Eli had ever been, filled with thousands of people, hundreds of buildings, the constant noise and energy of civilization at its most concentrated. After months in the wilderness, it felt overwhelming and alien. But it was also anonymous. In a city this size, two strangers could disappear into the crowd, could be just another pair of immigrants trying to make their way in the new world. It was exactly what they needed. Finding the right journalist proved harder than Eli anticipated. Most of the local papers were interested in Canadian affairs, not American territorial politics. But finally, through a series of careful inquiries and connections made in boarding house common rooms, they were introduced to a man named Thomas Whitmore, an American expatriate who'd fled Boston after publishing exposés about political corruption that had made him too many powerful enemies. Whitmore lived in a cramped apartment above a printer's shop, surrounded by towers of newspapers, books, and loose papers covered with cramped handwriting. He was 45, rail-thin, with ink-stained fingers and the intense, focused energy of someone perpetually chasing the next story. "So," he said, After Eli and Tao Lin had settled into the mismatched chairs in his cluttered parlor, "You claim to have a story about land corruption in the Montana Territory. I've heard 100 such stories. What makes yours different?" Eli met his eyes steadily. "Because mine is about how a powerful man orchestrated a terrorist attack against his own people to justify crushing a resistance movement, and I can prove it." Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "That's a serious accusation. You have evidence?" "I have testimony from an explosives dealer who can confirm the timers were tampered with. I have my own account of what happened. And if you investigate, you'll find inconsistencies in the official story, things that don't add up unless someone was deliberately manipulating events. Testimony can be dismissed as hearsay. Inconsistencies can be explained away. What I need is documentation, records, something that can't be denied." Eli felt frustration rising. "We were running for our lives. We didn't exactly stop to gather paperwork." "Then I'm afraid I can't help you." Whitmore stood, the interview clearly over. "I'm sorry for what you've been through, but without hard evidence, publishing your accusations would be libel. I'd be sued into oblivion, and your story would be dismissed as the ravings of wanted fugitives." "Please." Eli stood as well, desperation sharpening his voice. "People died. Good people who were fighting for their right to exist on their own terms. If their story isn't told, if Crane's version becomes the only version, then they died for nothing." Whitmore paused, his hand on the door. Something in Eli's voice seemed to reach him. "Why does this matter so much to you? You escaped. You're safe here. Why risk exposure by telling this story?" "Because I'm tired of hiding, tired of running. Tired of letting powerful people decide who gets to exist and who gets erased." Eli's voice cracked with emotion. "I've spent my entire life being someone I wasn't supposed to be, surviving by staying invisible. But Wei didn't die so I could keep hiding. He died believing that standing up mattered, that resistance mattered, that making powerful people uncomfortable mattered. If I walk away now, if I let his death be forgotten, then I'm betraying everything he believed in." Whitmore studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed and returned to his chair. "All right, tell me everything. Every detail, every name, every event. I can't promise I'll publish it, but I'll listen." For the next 3 hours, Eli told the story, from his arrival in Red Hollow to Wei's death in the snow. Tao Lin added his perspective, filling in details Eli had missed or couldn't have known. Whitmore took notes furiously, occasionally stopping them to ask clarifying questions or probe for specifics. When they finished, Whitmore sat back, his face troubled. "If even half of what you're telling me is true, this is bigger than just one corrupt land developer. This is about how the territorial system itself enables exploitation and violence, about how law becomes a weapon for those with enough money to buy it." "So you'll publish it?" "I need to verify what I can first. Independently confirm details, find supporting evidence. Give me 2 weeks." Whitmore met Eli's eyes. "But I warn you, publishing this will make you visible again. Crane will know you survived, will know where you are. If he has reached beyond the American territories, he could come for you here. Let him come. I'm done running." The 2 weeks felt like 2 years. Eli and Tao Lin found work at the docks, loading and unloading ships, losing themselves in the anonymity of physical labor. At night, Eli lay awake wondering if Whitmore would actually follow through, or if they'd exposed themselves for nothing. Then, on a gray morning in early May, Whitmore appeared at their boarding house with a newspaper in his hands and a grim smile on his face. "It published," he said simply, handing the paper to Eli. The headline read, "The Red Hollow Massacre, How Corporate Greed and Government Corruption Turned Resistance into Tragedy." Below it was Whitmore's byline, and beneath that, Eli's story. All of it, told with meticulous detail and careful sourcing. Whitmore had somehow tracked down Cooper, the explosives dealer, and gotten him to confirm the tampering on the record. He'd found other sources too, former Crane employees willing to testify to intimidation and violence, land office clerks who'd witnessed fraud, even one of Pike's deputies who'd grown disgusted with the marshal's corruption. The article was devastating. It exposed Crane's methods, questioned the legitimacy of his land claims, and most importantly, reframed the Red Hollow resistance not as terrorism, but as a desperate response to systematic oppression. It made Wei and the others into tragic heroes rather than villains. It told the truth. "This will spread," Whitmore said. "I've sent copies to every major paper in the eastern United States. Some will publish it, some won't, but the story is out now. Crane can't contain it." Eli felt tears burning his eyes as he read Way's name in print, as he saw the young man's courage and sacrifice memorialized for anyone who cared to read. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means." "Actually, I do. I've been where you are, watching injustice happen and feeling powerless to stop it. This is what I can do, what I'm good at, turning stories into weapons that can wound even the powerful." Over the following weeks, the article did exactly what Whitmore predicted. It spread. Papers across the United States picked it up, some with editorial commentary supporting Eli's claims, others condemning them, but still spreading the story. Questions were raised in the territorial legislature. Federal investigators began looking into Crane's land acquisitions. Public opinion, which had been unanimous in its condemnation of the Red Hollow terrorists, began to fracture and shift. And in Red Hollow itself, things began to change. Eli learned this through letters that began arriving at Whitmore's address, letters from people who'd read the article, who'd been inspired by it, who wanted to tell their own stories of resistance against Crane and men like him. Keller wrote saying that Crane's grip on the town had loosened after the article published, that people were openly questioning his authority now, that some of his purchased officials had resigned rather than continue serving him. Sarah Coltrane wrote from hiding in northern Montana, saying the article had given her hope that she might one day return home without facing a noose. Even Martha Hendricks sent a brief note from somewhere in Alberta, thanking Eli for telling the truth about what had happened and why. But the most significant letter came in late June, on official territorial government stationery. It was from the new Territorial Attorney General, a reformer elected in the wave of outrage following the article's publication. The letter informed Eli that the charges against him had been reviewed and dismissed due to insufficient evidence and questions about the legitimacy of the original warrants. He was no longer wanted. He was free to return to American territory if he chose. Eli read the letter 3 times, unable to quite believe it. Free. After months of running and hiding, after losing everything and everyone, he was simply free. "What will you do?" Tao Lin asked that evening as they sat in the boarding house common room. "I don't know. I never thought I'd get this far." "You could return to Montana, reclaim your land, rebuild your life." Eli considered this, but the thought of returning to Red Hollow felt wrong somehow. That place was haunted by too many ghosts, too much loss. "I think that part of my life is over. I'm not the same person who rode into that valley looking for isolation." "No, you are someone far stronger now, someone who has faced the worst and survived it." Tao Lin smiled. "So what does this stronger person want?" Eli thought about the question seriously. What did he want? Not just survival anymore. He'd proven he could manage that. Not revenge. Crane's empire was crumbling on its own, his daughter's injuries having turned public opinion against him in ways Eli's resistance never could. Not even justice, exactly, though the vindication felt good. What he wanted, Eli realized, was to live. Really live, not just exist. To build something real and lasting with the hard-won freedom he'd fought for. To honor Way's memory and the memory of everyone else who'd paid the price for resistance by using that freedom well. "I want to help others," Eli said slowly. "People like us. People who don't fit. Who are running from something. Who need a place where they can be themselves without fear. I want to create that place. A sanctuary. More than that, a community. Where the rules are different. Where power doesn't automatically belong to those born into it. Where people are judged by their character rather than their gender or origin or anything else they can't control." Eli looked at Tao Lin. "Is that naive? Is it even possible?" "Naive? Perhaps. Impossible. No." The old man's eyes gleamed with something like pride. "I have seen you accomplish impossible things already. Why should this be any different?" Over the following months, Eli and Tao Lin began to build exactly that. They purchased land in northern Alberta with money. Whitmore helped them raise through sympathetic donors who'd read the article. It was raw territory, difficult and demanding, but it was theirs without question or compromise. They built cabins and barns, cleared fields, established trade routes with nearby settlements. And slowly, word began to spread. A place where outcasts were welcome, where Chinese laborers could work without exploitation, where women could own property and run businesses, where people who lived between genders or outside them entirely could exist without constant justification or fear, where the only rule that mattered was mutual respect and willingness to work hard. They came in trickles at first, a few desperate individuals, then families, then larger groups. Sarah Coltrane arrived in the spring of 1873, bringing with her 3 other survivors of the Red Hollow resistance. Keller showed up 6 months later, having finally abandoned his supply depot to Crane's collapsing empire. Former Chinese railroad workers fleeing indentured servitude, women escaping violent marriages or suffocating social expectations, indigenous people displaced by American expansion, everyone who'd been told they didn't belong anywhere else. The settlement grew. They called it New Haven, though Eli privately thought of it as Way's legacy, a place built on the principles the young man had died defending. Within 2 years, it had 50 permanent residents and a reputation throughout the Northern Territories as a place of refuge and second chances. And Eli thrived there in ways he'd never imagined possible. The constant vigilance required to maintain his masculine presentation eased as the community proved itself genuinely accepting of complexity and difference. He began to experiment with presentation, some days leaning into traditionally masculine clothing and bearing, other days allowing himself softer expressions that felt equally authentic. The binding remained. It was still safer, still more comfortable for his own sense of self. But the crushing fear of discovery faded. People knew. Some figured it out through observation, others through whispered stories. But in New Haven, it didn't matter. Eli was their founder, their leader, the person who'd stood against impossible odds and somehow survived to build something better. His past, his body, his identity, none of it diminished the respect he'd earned through action and principle. It was Tao Lin who first suggested they formalize their governance structure, create actual written principles that would outlast any individual founder. They gathered the community in the main hall they'd built, a large timber structure that served as meeting place, school, and social center, and spent weeks debating and refining what would become the New Haven Compact. The principles were simple but radical for their time. All residents had equal voice, regardless of gender, origin, or social status. Land could be owned but not hoarded. Disputes were resolved through community consensus rather than imposed authority. Violence was forbidden except in legitimate self-defense. No one would be turned away for being different, only for harming others. Eli stood before the assembled community on the day they ratified the compact, looking out at the faces of people who'd become family. Sarah Coltrane with her ever-present rifle. Keller, his hard edges softened by the work of building rather than surviving. Former miners and farmers and laborers who'd found new purposes. Children born in New Haven who would grow up never knowing the crushing limitations their parents had fled. Way would have loved this, Eli said, his voice carrying through the hall. He died believing that resistance mattered, that standing up to power could change things. This community is proof he was right. Not because we defeated Crane, we didn't, not completely, but because we refused to let him define us. We survived, and we built something better than what we left behind. The community ratified the compact unanimously, and that night they celebrated with music and food and stories long into the night. Tao Lin sat beside Eli on the porch of the main hall, watching people dance and laugh, their joy unburdened by the fears that had once governed their lives. "Do you ever regret it?" the old man asked quietly. "All the pain and loss it took to get here?" Eli considered the question carefully. Did he regret Way's death or the deaths of the others who'd fallen in Red Hollow? The months of terror and running? The violence and loss? "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret that the world is built in such a way that people like us have to fight so hard just to exist. But I don't regret fighting, and I don't regret what we've built because of it." "That is wisdom," Tao Lin said. "Hard-won, but real." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the music and laughter. Then Tao Lin spoke again. "I am old, Eli. I have lived longer than I expected to, seen more than I deserved. When my time comes, and it will come soon, I want you to know that these years with you, building this place, have been the finest of my life. You gave an old soldier a final mission worth fighting for." Eli felt his throat tighten. "You're not going anywhere yet. You're too stubborn to die." "Perhaps. But when I do, promise me you will continue this work. Continue building places where people can be free. Continue telling the stories of those who fought and fell. Continue being the living proof that resistance matters." "I promise." Tao Lin died peacefully in his sleep 2 winters later, at the age of 74. The entire community gathered for his funeral, and Eli spoke of the old soldier's courage, his wisdom, his unwavering commitment to justice and dignity. They buried him on a hill overlooking New Haven with a marker that read, "Tao Lin, soldier, friend, builder of better worlds." In the years that followed, Eli kept his promise. New Haven continued to grow, eventually establishing daughter settlements in other parts of Canada and even cautiously back in the American territories as political climates shifted. The model they'd created, communities built on mutual respect and collective governance rather than hierarchy and exploitation, proved remarkably resilient and began to spread. Eli never returned to Red Hollow, but he heard that Crane's empire had indeed collapsed under the weight of scandal and federal investigation. The man died bitter and alone, his daughter having renounced him after learning the truth about what he'd done. The lands he'd seized were gradually returned to legitimate owners or open to honest settlement. Marshall Pike was removed from office and faced charges of corruption, though he escaped prison through legal maneuvering. In 1885, 13 years after fleeing the Montana Territory, Eli received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Whitfield, the attorney who'd once tried to broker Crane's offer, appeared at New Haven's gates looking old and tired but carrying something precious, a leather folder filled with documents. "I've spent the last decade working as a reformer," Whitfield explained as they sat in Eli's cabin, "trying to undo some of the damage men like Crane inflicted. I thought you might want to see these." The documents were testimony from the trials that had followed the federal investigations. Cooper, the explosives dealer, had finally overcome his fear and testified in detail about the scarred man tampering with the timers. Other witnesses had come forward. The full scope of Crane's conspiracy had been exposed and entered into official record. But the most precious document was a handwritten letter from Wei's family in Guangdong Province. Somehow, word of his death and the role he'd played in the resistance had reached them. The letter was in Chinese, which Eli couldn't read, but Whitfield had brought a translation. It thanked Eli for standing with their son, for honoring his memory, for ensuring his death meant something. Eli held the letter with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. "How did they find out?" "Your journalist friend Whitmore has been corresponding with Chinese-language newspapers. The story spread farther than you know." Whitfield smiled gently. "You changed more than you realize, Eli, not just here in New Haven, but across the territories. People read about what you did and found the courage to resist in their own ways. Small victories mostly, but they add up." After Whitfield left, Eli climbed the hill to Tao Lin's grave and sat beside it, reading Wei's family's letter aloud in English, though they would never hear it. He told them about New Haven, about the life they'd built, about how their son's courage had inspired a community that would outlast them all. The years continued to pass. Eli's hair turned gray, his face weathered by time and hard work. New leaders emerged in New Haven, younger people born into the community or who'd arrived as children, who carried forward the principles their elders had established but added their own innovations and dreams. On his 60th birthday, the community held a celebration in Eli's honor. Someone had commissioned a painting for the occasion, a large canvas depicting the founding of New Haven, with Eli, Tao Lin, Wei, and the other early settlers working together to raise the first cabin. It wasn't strictly accurate historically, since Wei had never made it to New Haven, but it was true in a deeper sense. His spirit, his courage, his belief in the possibility of better worlds had been there from the beginning. Sarah Coltrane, now in her 50s and the community's chief security officer, presented the painting with a speech that made Eli cry. "You taught us that who we are born as doesn't determine who we can become. That courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. That building something better than what we inherited is always possible, even when it seems impossible. New Haven exists because you refused to accept the world as it was and dared to imagine it as it could be. That night, alone in his cabin, Eli looked at himself in the mirror, the same cracked mirror that had hung in the mountain cabin all those years ago, carefully transported through all their moves and rebuilding. The face looking back was old now, lined and weathered, but the eyes were the same, sharp, determined, carrying secrets but no longer crushed by their weight. He thought about the terrified 17-year-old who'd fled into the territories with nothing but desperate hope and a new name. About the lonely drifter who'd ridden into Red Hollow, expecting nothing more than anonymous survival. About the person who'd stood against impossible odds because running had finally become more painful than fighting. That person, all those versions of himself, had led to this moment, to a thriving community built on principles of dignity and mutual respect, to a life that mattered, that had changed things, that would be remembered. Eli Thorn smiled at his reflection, and for the first time in his entire life, felt completely at peace with who he was and what he'd become. He lived another 20 years, dying at 80 in his sleep, surrounded by the community he'd built and the family he'd chosen. New Haven had grown to nearly 200 permanent residents by then, with daughter communities across the Northern Territories. The principles he and Tao Lin and the others had established had spread and evolved, influencing how people thought about governance and community and the rights of those who existed outside society's narrow definitions. At his funeral, they told his story, all of it, hiding nothing. About Eliana, who became Eli Thorn, about the winter in the mountains, about Wei's sacrifice and Tao Lin's wisdom, about the fight against Crane and the choice to build rather than destroy, about the courage it took to live authentically in a world that punished authenticity. And they carved on his marker, next to where Tao Lin lay, Eli Thorn, who taught us that resistance matters, that building matters more, and that freedom is worth any price. His story didn't end with his death. It lived on in the communities he'd helped create, in the principles he'd established, in the countless people who found refuge and purpose because he'd refused to accept the world as it was. It lived in the written records carefully preserved in New Haven's archives, in the oral histories passed down through generations, in the example of a life lived with courage and defiance and ultimate triumph. And sometimes, on quiet evenings in New Haven, old-timers would gather and tell the story of the stranger who'd carved a life from stone, who'd stood against power when everyone said it was impossible, who'd built a better world from the ashes of the old. They told it to their children and grandchildren, keeping the memory alive, keeping the lesson fresh. That one person, standing up, could matter. That resistance, even when it seemed futile, could change everything. That the price of freedom was high but worth paying. And that the greatest legacy anyone could leave was not wealth or power, but the example of a life lived with integrity, courage, and an unwavering commitment to making the world better than they found it. The wind still howled through the northern valleys, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But in New Haven and the communities it had inspired, people faced those storms together, standing firm against whatever challenges came, knowing that they stood on ground built by those who'd refused to be broken, refused to surrender, and refused to let power define who they could be or what they could build. And that was Eli Thorn's true victory. Not defeating Crane, not escaping the noose, not even surviving against impossible odds. His victory was in proving that another way was possible, that communities built on mutual respect and collective dignity could thrive, and that the most powerful act of resistance was simply refusing to disappear. His name lived on, not in monuments of stone, but in the living example of people who'd learned from his courage and built their own versions of freedom. And in the end, that was the only monument that mattered, the one written in lives changed, communities built, and the enduring truth that resistance, even when it costs everything, is always worth the price. The story of Eli Thorn was complete. But the work he'd started, the dream he'd fought for, the world he'd helped build, that continued, carried forward by hands he'd never known, in places he'd never seen, by people who remembered that one person, standing against the impossible, had made all the difference.